Ladies and gentlemen, dear all, Mr. President, of course, 30 years ago, riding the waves of a failed coup d'etat in Moscow, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania managed to escape from the Absurdi Imperium, as some Estonian historians once called it, the Soviet Union. Time has not healed the wounds of the past. On the contrary, relations between the Baltic republics and Russia, the self-proclaimed legal successor of the USSR, are more tense than they have ever been since 1991. The nitty-gritty is that a symbiosis of issues of a practical kind and radically opposed interpretations of modern history. And as a paradox, this has also brought a certain amount of convenience, a solid affirmative notion of the other and one's own national identity. Well, it goes without saying that since the occupation of the Crimea by Russia in 2014, its attempts to destabilize eastern Ukraine, and Mr. Putin's display of authoritarianism, the Baltic perception of the mighty eastern neighbor has even become more negative. However, it would be fair to ask ourselves whether this one-dimensional perception of Russia needs some modification, taking into account recent and potential political developments. Ladies and gentlemen, it is hard to imagine now that in the final days of the Soviet Empire, in the early days of the post-Cold War era, mutual relations between the Baltic republics and Russia were even quite good. President Yeltsin offered support when the special forces of the USSR intervened in Vilnius and Riga in early 91. And during the aforementioned coup in August, Mr. Yeltsin was also there to endorse the Baltic states. More than that, he was even the first, or one of the first, to recognize Baltic independence. Anyway, things would change soon. The settlement of the Soviet divorce, to put it that way, would in the course of the 1990s gravely affect relations with Russia. The failure to conclude a border treaty with Estonia and disagreements about the legal position of the Russian minorities residing in Estonia and Latvia have cast a long shadow over their relationship with Moscow. Des Pudels Kern, as the Germans call it, is to view the perception of the latter, so of Moscow, that the peace treaties that Estonia and Latvia concluded with Soviet Russia in 1920 are no longer valid. In other words, Moscow has never relinquished the Soviet thesis that the Baltic republics joined the USSR voluntarily in 1940, ceased to exist as sovereign states and entities of international law, and with that, all the treaties that they had concluded. The consequences being that there still is no ratified border treaty with Estonia, and that Russia keeps complaining about the stateless position of the Soviet immigrants in Estonia and Latvia, who, in its view, had every right to move to the new Soviet republics. As you might know, Lithuania's position is a different one. It concluded a border treaty with Russia in October 1997, for it had no territorial disputes with Russia. Inhabitants of Soviet origin, the number of whom was much smaller than in Estonia and Latvia, managed to acquire Lithuanian citizenship at an early stage, even 90% of them in 1991. But like its Baltic brothers, Lithuania has stressed the principle of legal continuation since 1940. But it has also referred, much more than Estonia and Latvia, to the principle of the inviolability of the existing borders, which is no coincidence. Even Mikhail Gorbachev reminded the Lithuanians that the Soviet authorities had handed over Vilnius to Lithuania in October 1939. But in reality, that was just a means to exert pressure on the then Lithuanian government to sign a treaty of mutual assistance with Stalin, which was, of course, the first step to the occupation of 1940. Its deviating position didn't keep Lithuania from speeding up its efforts to join NATO, like Estonia and Latvia. Tensions surrounding Russia's transit to the Kaliningrad exclave played a major role here, but especially the changing political climate in Russia itself. Old school phrases like, and forgive me my poor Russian pronunciation, blizneye zarubzhi, or the near abroad as it is known in standard literature, began circulating again, reminding the Balts of the much hated concept of spheres of influence. So a rather unpleasant feeling started surging that our vulnerable countries might end up in a halitsoni, as then Estonian President Meri put it, which means a gray zone between NATO and Russia, where the latter, once again, could get a free hand. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to make a leap in time. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have not ended up in a gray zone. They joined NATO in 2004, just in the nick of time in their view. After a brief period of détente in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Russia would relapse into its old reflex of rivalry with NATO, especially when pro-Western revolts in Georgia and Ukraine broke out. As Lithuanian political scientist Linas Kojala described it in one of his books, and this is my translation, this marked the end of a crucial stage, the window of opportunity that had only been opened a while earlier. Before that, and that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had been able to climb through was closed again. Meanwhile, since the Wende, another German word of 2014, the three Baltic republics have become frontline states in a new cold conflict between Russia and the West. The feeling that Russia poses a military threat to the national security, both in a conventional and a hybrid way, has increased. Yet, a deeper underlying problem has been discerned as well. In his book Fene Idee, The Russian Idea, the conservative Estonian intellectual Andres Herkel, also a former MP, called it worrisome that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has tried to fill up the painful black hole with all kind of archaic, pan-Slavic, Eurasian concepts. According to Herkel, the Russian idea is more dangerous than ever, since there is no temptation, or there is a temptation to implement it. In comparison to the past, it has become less metaphysical and more of an integral part of aggressive geopolitics. So, therefore, it is understandable that in the foreseeable future, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will remain strongly focused on the whims of its former colonizer in the East. However, one major development in international politics may affect this dominant framework of Baltic foreign policy, the rise of China. Estonia, Latvia, and especially Lithuania have already become familiar with the assertiveness of the People's Republic that has also tried to spread its economic tentacles to the northeast of Europe and to gain influence in society there. Nor can they disregard the fact that the United States, their main patron, are perceiving China as rival number one these days, and not Russia. Two additional factors that in the end may impinge that dominant foreign political framework should be mentioned as well, briefly. How will the common foreign and security policy of the EU and its self-proclaimed strategic autonomy relate to Russia? The EU's hard core, including future German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, prefers a constructive dialogue with Russia. And finally, although it is a matter of sheer speculation, of course, how will a breakthrough of right-wing populism correlate with a tough policy vis-à-vis Russia? The EKRE party in Estonia, the Conservative People's Party, is already trying to seduce the Russian-speaking part of the electorate in Estonia and became the leading party in opinion polls this month. Ladies and gentlemen, when looking back on 30 years of restored Baltic relations, Baltic-Russian relations, I should say, one can only be skeptical about the next 30 years, unless a democratic revolution will spread across Russia, or an increasingly aggressive China will force Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to change their foreign policy and defense policy in a radical way. Labai at you for your attention.